Harold would never forget the strange house in the middle of the cul-de-sac. There were all sorts of rumors about that house, but most were just the stories children made up to explain strange things. The local kids said that the woman who lived there was a witch. They said that she kidnapped and ate children. They said that if you went by that house at night, you could see strange lights coming from the basement, and sometimes you could hear screams after dark. They claimed that she had lived there for years and years, and that the old woman had existed there for generations. When Harold asked his mother about these things, she said that Mrs. Renfro was just a lonely old lady who lived all alone. However, his friend Davy Parker insisted that she was a witch. If she's just a normal old lady, how come animals won't go into her house? On that, he was right. Not all animals, Harold supposed. Mostly just cats. Cats would not come anywhere near Miss Renfro's house. There were many strays on the road, cats squatting in people's yards to hunt mice or snakes, but none of them would go anywhere near Miss Renfro's house. The cats wouldn't even use the sidewalk in front of her fence. You could watch them sometimes, as they stopped at the fence line and crossed the street instead, risking being hit by traffic instead of walking near her home. It was as if there was a magnetic pulse around the place that repelled members of the feline race. She owned cats, of course. The boys had seen her take many of them into the house, all of them hissing and yowling as they battered against their carrier. Once they went in, though, they never saw any of them again. There was talk around town that the local animal shelter wouldn't give her cats anymore. They said that she'd been housing about 4 to 5 a year for as long as anyone could remember. But when a well check found that none of the cats were on the premises, they had stopped letting her foster them. That didn't stop her from getting them, though. She had traps that she set up around town and worked out a deal with the local dog catcher to bring her cats when he found them. Mr. Barley was not what you would call a nice guy. He was mean enough to dogs, and most people would believe that he would trap cats for her. His son Thomas was a big brute, known for throwing bags of animals into the local river for entertainment. He'd been picked up by the police a time or two for hurting people's pets, and that kind of behavior was usually learned from somewhere. Harold and his friends, Ralph, Stephen, and Davy, had been watching the house for as long as they could remember. Mrs. Renfro never decorated for holidays. She never handed out candy for Halloween. She never returned any of the balls or toys that might land in her yard, and chased away anyone who tried to retrieve them. No one ever went there to sell magazines or chocolate bars for school fundraisers, and if they tried, they were always chased away. Mrs. Renfro was a sour old woman, somewhere in her late 50s or early 60s, but there was talk that she might have been older than that. Harold's mother told him about how Mrs. Renfro had acted the same way when she was a kid. It couldn't have been the same Mrs. Renfro, though it does look just like her. She constantly ran kids off her property, or yelled at those who rode their bikes too close to the fence. She was a sour old crone, but this must be her daughter or a cousin or something. The Mrs. Renfro that I knew would be older than dirt by now. She told the boys this story as they sat eating watermelon on the back porch one summer, and it sparked a real fire in them. They wanted to know more about Mrs. Renfro, and in their minds, it could absolutely be the same one. Her reputation for being a wicked old witch had been cemented in the minds of most of the town's children. The idea that she had existed there for multiple generations wasn't as far-fetched as Harold's mom had thought it was. So, as they started their school break, the boys began spying on their reclusive neighbor. Like the nerd he was, Ralph wanted to start with the boring bits. "We should go to the library. We can see if they have the same Mrs. Renfro that lived there when Harold's mom was a kid." "And how are we going to do that?" Davy asked. "You know they're not going to let a bunch of kids go and look at records like that. Those kinds of things are only for lawyers and policemen. The two had argued about it, but in the end, they had decided that some good old-fashioned surveillance might be their best option. So, they had staked out the old lady's house for the next week. The boys left on their bikes around daybreak and got a good spot on Davy's front porch. Davy's house was right across from hers on the cul-de-sac and had the best view of her front yard. They stayed and watched the house until the streetlights came on, all of them racing for home before they got into trouble. The streetlights meant it was dinner time, and missing dinner would make their mothers into bigger monsters than that mean old witch, Mrs. Renfro. After 5 days, the boys hadn't seen much, besides Mrs. Renfro coming home with a new cat in a carrier. Davy was getting frustrated as the sun set on Friday afternoon. "This is stupid," he said as he threw his binoculars against the grass. "We've given up 2 perfectly good baseball games, a bike race with Mark Hollister, and a chance to go to the movies on Thursday, just to watch this old lady's house." "Well, how else do you think we're going to find anything out?" Harold asked. Davy thought about it for a minute, and then he got an idea. He went inside, and the other 3 boys heard him talking to his mother. He was using his pleading voice, the voice he put on when he was trying to convince her to give him some money or let him do something. They all knew he would manage whatever he was after. Davy's mom was a soft touch, and always had been. After a little back and forth, they heard him exclaim how much he loved her and come back outside. He had his chest puffed out as he came to join them, and a smile that made him look like the cat that had caught the canary. "Ask your parents when you get home tonight if you can stay on Saturday. I think most of the good stuff happens after dark, so we can watch from the front windows and catch it." They all agreed, saying that sounded like a great idea. Davy's dad, a trucker who was on the road more than not, was still off on a delivery. Davy's mom was the doting sort, who loved to give her son whatever he wanted. That meant that even if they didn't catch Mrs. Renfro in anything, they could still play Super Nintendo or watch scary movies in his room. Even if they didn't solve the mystery of the neighborhood witch, it would still be a fun night. To no one's surprise, their parents agreed to let them stay the night, and as the sun began to set Saturday night, all 4 were in the living room with their binoculars out. Davy's mother had told them to not make too much racket and gone up to read in her bed. They were trying to be sneaky, but anyone could have seen the binoculars hiding underneath Mrs. Parker's gauzy curtains in the living room. It had been a slow day on watch, and the boys hadn't seen Mrs. Renfro leave her house all day. They supposed she might have snuck out while they were eating lunch or munching on the pizza that Davy's mom had bought them, but they doubted it. Her old van was still in the same position, and the package the postman had left that morning was still sitting on the doorstep. It had been an all-day event, and the boys almost vibrated with excitement as they watched the sun set behind her creepy old house. As darkness began to fall, Stephen said he thought he saw something from one of the basement windows. They all looked in that direction, and sure enough, there was something going on down there. A weird funhouse glow was coming from the windows, a soupy green color, like you saw in scary movies. Davy said he thought he saw smoke, too, and the longer they looked, the more the boys imagined that they could see smoke curling up from underneath the windowsill. Not the kind of smoke you got from a fire, of course. This was soft and translucent, like the smoke you saw when your mom made soup. "I knew it! I knew if we stayed past dark we'd see something." Harold thought the glow was cool, but it wasn't really proof of anything. For all they knew, that's where she kept her TV, and she was just watching something weird. Maybe she was down there smoking the stuff that he caught his sister puffing on behind the house, and they were watching no more than her relaxing after a long day of being terrible. Either way, the glow wasn't much proof of anything. "We need to get closer," someone said. It wasn't until Harold found the other 3 looking at him that he realized he had been the one to say it. "That's a great idea," Davy said, putting down his binoculars. He looked pretty excited about the prospect of sneaking up on the old woman's house, but Harold suddenly wished he hadn't said anything. Mrs. Renfro's house was creepy enough in the daytime, and the idea of going over her fence at night was a little too spooky for him. It was just a thought, guys. If she caught us sneaking over there after dark, she'd have we can go out the back and creep around the side of the house, Davy said, clearly not listening. My mom will never hear the door and think we've just gone up to my room if she comes downstairs. Stephen and Ralph were all for it, though Harold thought Ralph looked a little queasy. Just to be safe, they all went running up the stairs like a herd of gazelles to get their flashlights from their backpack. They had all brought them with the idea of telling scary stories later that night, but they might be put to better use now. Once they had them, they snuck back downstairs as quietly as they could and managed to make their way out the back door. There was still a little stab of daylight left as they came through Davy's backyard and around the front of the house. As they crossed the street in a mad hustle, it dipped below the horizon and left them in darkness, at least until the street lights came on in a small flurry of snapping bulbs. They stood beneath one of the lamplights, crouching low as they observed the front of Mrs. Renfro's house. The front lawn was covered in tall grass and weeds, children's toys dotting it like pirate treasure. From behind all the tall grass, they could see the green glow as it came from the small windows. The boys hopped the low fence as they snuck through the hip-high grass and up to the windows. As they lay on their bellies and looked down through those slats, Harold could see that Mrs. Renfro was not, in fact, watching TV and relaxing after a long day. What they saw seemed to be better proof that she was a witch. The basement looked identical to the one in Harold's house. A single steep staircase ran down into a concrete room with shelves and hooks on the wall. The floor, a flat sheet of concrete. Instead of a washer, a dryer, and a mound of holiday decorations, however, a large metal pot sat in the middle of the floor. The pot, more like a bathtub than a soup pot, was the source of the green glow, and the liquid inside swirled with eldritch light. Mrs. Renfro was stirring it with a long spoon or maybe a broom handle, and though her mouth was moving, none of them could tell what she was saying. On a shelf near the pot was the cat they had seen her bring in a few days before. "Holy crap," whispered Ralph, pushing away from the window. "She really is a witch." Harold nodded, all of them moving back from the window so she couldn't see them. But Davy stayed put. He was focused on that cat, the one on the shelf that she was clearly planning to do something with. Harold didn't really like how intent he was. Davy was prone to doing things that weren't strictly smart sometimes, things that might be considered noble if they weren't so suicidal. Last summer, Davy had saved a kid from drowning at Gopher Pond, an act that had almost sent him under as well. The year before, he had shoved a kid out of the way of a truck, earning himself a broken arm and a commendation from the mayor. Davy didn't lack for courage. Sometimes he lacked for sense, though. When he picked up the rock, Harold was afraid that he might throw it through the little window and give them away. Instead, he rolled like a log and tossed it at Miss Renfro's front door. The old woman stiffened, climbing down off her stool as she hobbled towards the stairs on her gouty legs. "What are you doing?" Harold whispered, looking at Davy incredulously. "Getting that cat," Davy said. As she got to the top of the stairs, he pushed the window and grinned as it popped inward. He slid inside as Ralph began to hyperventilate, and Stephen asked what the heck he thought he was doing. Harold whispered he didn't know, but quieted as the front door came open and a quavery voice cascaded across the lawn. "Who is it?" she croaked, sounding more like a bullfrog than a woman. "What nasty beasties are taking me from my work?" The three boys got as low as they could in that tall grass, hoping it would cover them as the specter descended the steps. "Are you hiding?" she rasped, the stairs squeaking under her feet as her bunched old legs brought her closer to the yard. Harold put a hand over Ralph's mouth as his wheezing became louder. He undoubtedly needed his inhaler, but the sound of its trigger would alert the old biddy. Stephen had begun to shimmy a little, trying to get around the edge of the house, but as her patent leather shoe came down with a clump on the cobblestone path in front of her, he froze like a statue. If she had a flashlight, they'd be seen, but Harold didn't think she had one. She hadn't turned on the porch light either, and with any luck, her old eyes wouldn't see them if they stayed absolutely still. She took a step into the grass, and Harold almost pulled his hand away as he felt Ralph's tears touch his skin. She took another, and Harold thought she might be casting a spell before he realized it was just Stephen, quietly praying. She took a third step, and Harold shut his eyes tight as he hoped beyond hope that she wouldn't see them. The seconds slipped on for an indeterminate time, but finally she turned and hobbled back up the stairs. When the door closed, they all breathed a sigh of relief before pulling back to the window to see if Davy had been caught. Not only had Davy not been caught, but as they caught sight of him, he was lifting the cat carrier off the shelf. He had taken the stepladder that the witch had been standing on and was reaching on tiptoes to grasp the side of the cat carrier. None of them could hear if the cat was cooperating, but it didn't look as if Davy was going to manage to get the cage off the shelf without dropping it. Harold had just shimmied to go help him when the croak of the witch brought him up short and sealed Davy's fate. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" she screeched, and Davy must have jumped because he was suddenly falling towards the tub of glowing liquid. The cat carrier fell to the concrete with a smack, and a small white animal shot out like a cannonball as it tore off towards the upstairs. It ran right between the startled legs of the crone, but she was more interested in the boy that was now bobbing in her cauldron. They both began to scream simultaneously. Mrs. Renfro doubled over, falling down the stairs as she clutched at her stomach. She was still when she came to rest on the concrete, but Harold could see her twitching as whatever was happening took effect. The tub could not have been deeper than a foot or two, but Davy was suddenly splashing like a drowning man. He was shrinking, his skin growing taut and spotted, his hair growing gray and brittle. His teeth fell out, floating in the soup before dissolving into nothing. His eyes joined them, his skeletal hands still grasping at hope. As they watched, their friend shuddered out a last few moments of his life, his body dissolving as he sank into the tub. They ran screaming from the yard, thundering into Davy's house as they went to find the closest adult they could. The police were there before they could finish telling it all, and the 4 squad cars lit up the cul-de-sac like a Christmas light show. Harold's father was amongst them, being one of the deputies for their little town, which was how Harold found out more than he strictly wanted to the next day. Harold had gone home with his mother, Mrs. Parker speaking with the police as she begged them to find her son. He had gone to sleep on the couch under the scratchy afghan his mother had crocheted, and dreamed about the pool of liquid in Mrs. Renfro's basement. In the dream, Davy's skeleton had burst out of it as he stood beside the cauldron, grabbing him and trying to drag him in. It screamed and screamed, his ears ringing with it, and when he tossed and turned his way off the couch, he awoke to find his mother and father talking in the kitchen. Old Biddy was kinda nuts. She had all these books and diagrams, satanic stuff. She had this big tub of liquid down there. The coroner thinks it's acid or something, but they aren't really sure. He paused, and Harold almost heard the shudder in his father's voice. They found bone fragments at the bottom of the tub. They aren't sure, but they think they might be human." "Did they find any sign of Davy?" his mother asked. "Not really. They can't be sure that the bone fragments are his, but if the boy's story's right, I guess they'd have to be. I hope that terrible woman rots in prison," his mother half whispered, expressing more venom in her words than Harold had ever heard from her before. "Not unless we find her," he said unhappily. "She was gone when we arrived." "How far could she have gotten? She'd have to be pushing 100. "I don't know, but the journals I found will stick with me for a long time. She was..." He shuddered a little, and Harold peeked around the corner of the couch to snoop on his parents. "She was killing cats. She talked about how she would drown them in that tub and steal their lives." "Steal their lives?" "Cats were supposed to have 9 lives. She was stealing their lives to stay alive. She was so delusional. She thought the cats were keeping her from dying. The journal entries went way, way back, long before you and I were born. She was a sick woman who believed she'd lived for centuries." Mrs. Renfro's house sat empty for a long time. The families that moved in never stayed for long. They always said the same thing. They told the realtor that the house was lovely, but they felt watched while they were there. The toys disappeared from the yard, reclaimed by their owners, but Harold and his friends never returned to that house again. Davy's family moved away a few months after his disappearance. His mother couldn't deal with the loss of her son, and his house was soon occupied by a new family. Time went on. Harold and his friends returned to school. People forgot about Davy and Mrs. Renfro. A news story began to circulate, though, as the stories always do. Kids claimed to see a young woman walking the streets at night. She would lure children away, singing to them and telling them how she wanted to play. She was said to be luring more than a few teens away as well, though Harold doubted she had offered to play with them. There were reports of people missing, but never enough to spark much panic. They could be chalked up to runaways or kids lost in the woods, and the town continued. Harold knew that they were more than stories, though. He saw the woman outside his window most nights, he and Stephen and Ralph. She called to them, telling them to come and play. She told them that Davy missed them, and they could see him again if they wanted. When they refused her or ignored her, she would go into the woods behind their houses, disappearing into the shadows. Sometimes they could see a strange green glow from the woods late at night. Harold wondered how many years Mrs. Renfro had gotten from Davy, and how many more she would get before the town finally put an end to her. It is my pleasure to unveil an innovation in burial services. The investors looked uncomfortable as they sat in the hot sun on the edge of John's latest investment. When the tech mogul had bought 500 acres of swampland, people had speculated that he meant to build another factory for his microchips. Tech magazines had floated the idea of everything from warehouses to a new robotics division and everything in between, but none of them could have guessed his true intentions. His stock price had doubled since the announcement, and investors seemed to be holding their breath to see what would come out of Yomite Solutions this season. Only his accountant had known the real story, and he had been sworn to secrecy. "Not a word to anyone," John said, winking as his usual smile spread across his face. Wayne had snorted. "John, no one would believe me if I told them." Now here they were, their eyebrows raised as he talked about not some new piece of tech, but an innovation in the burial of all things. "Behind me stands 500 acres of new growth, trees ready to provide mankind with oxygen, and many helpful species of insects and wildlife will find a place to live here. Beneath them, however, are the first in a long line of subjects in our land renewal innovation. The bodies are infused with seeds. The seeds take root and use them for nourishment, and as such, become a sort of casket for the dead. He saw some of the squirming looks held by those gathered, and decided to squash them. Behind me stands what will one day be a new forest, a forest that will be untouchable thanks to the laws now in place. Think of it, every cemetery a forest, every boneyard a park, every place of death a place of rebirth. This is the future, a future that bodes well for the earth and for the health of our planet. Welcome to Yomite Pines Memorial Forest, a place of eternal rest and peace. The investors clapped. It wasn't over-enthusiastic, but they clapped. They would see, in time, that it was a good middle ground. John had done a lot of harm to this planet with his factories, his smog, and his landfills full of obsolete electronics. If he could turn people's minds and grow a memorial forest in every state, it would go a long way towards making him feel better about the business and his soul. John Yomite, in fact, hoped to be buried in one of these forests himself one day. He had no way of knowing how soon that dream might become a reality. That was the first night that he had the dream. He was running through the rows of newly planted pines, the ground groaning as they grew towards the heavens. They towered over him, their branches grasping for the sky, and as they blotted out the moon, he heard their whispers. Join us, join us, join us in the soil. The ground sucked at his feet as he ran. The sand clung to him as if trying to hold him down, and as he jogged through the park that he had created, a cold wind blew amongst the trees. He woke up in his bed as the whispers grew, and breathed a sigh of relief when he realized it had all been a dream. Did the water in his morning shower look a little darker as it went down the drain? Were there leaves in the pocket of his sleeping shorts? Was there maybe even some mud he overlooked on his arms and legs? Maybe, but if there were, John didn't see them. He shook it off his nerves as he got ready for the day, but it wouldn't be the last time he ran through the trees by night. Wow, John, if you'd told me this thing would take off like this a year ago, I would have called you crazy. John looked down over the forest of pines and oaks, their tops coming in as they grew strong. The glass window over his tower made the perfect observation platform, and the glass was thick enough to block out the whispers he sometimes heard when he walked the grounds. Wayne was going over the numbers, but John was barely listening. You did call me crazy, John said, looking down over his forest of trees. He had built this tower so he could watch the forest grow, and he found he was truly at peace when he stood up here. Watching them sway, watching them grow, it was all so different from anything he had done before. Did I? Wayne said. I guess I was wrong. This has been a bigger windfall than any of your previous endeavors. John would have agreed if it hadn't been for the incidences that kept cropping up. Who would have thought that people would pay so much to save the planet and to be one with the burgeoning forest? John asked. Now, if we could just figure out why people keep going missing, we'd be set, Wayne retorted. He said it with a laugh, but John really didn't find it funny. If it had been one or two, John could have understood, but what kind of memorial garden loses double-digit guests in their first year? The large forest had become a popular tourist spot, and people had come to camp and walk and take in the natural beauty of the new-growth forest. The trees were only about half the size that they would grow to be, but they were still an impressive stature. They were the living embodiment of those who had nourished them. At least that's what the papers and some of the journals were saying. There were plans to grow more of them if participation was good, and so far it had been. People were interested in helping the environment, and having a quiet and beautiful place for their relatives to visit them. And the list of people who had bought places in Yomite Pines would facilitate the buying of another 20 or 30 acres at least. It had all been looking so promising before people started going missing. At first, it wasn't anything to get excited about. A couple of campers never arrived back home. An older couple that never returned to their car after a visit. A man who never walked back out the front gate after walking in. These things were odd, but not unexplainable. People did all kinds of silly things, and this was no more than someone who simply decided to leave by another way, or had forgotten to check out, or perhaps decided to lose themselves on purpose and find a quiet place to die. The kid, however, was something else. Marcus Lorraine was 6 and had accompanied his parents into the little forest so he could visit his grandmother. They had walked amongst the trees, taken in the paths and little bridges and the shallow river that ran through it, but when they had turned to go, Miss Lorraine had noticed that her son was nowhere to be found. She swore he had been with them when they crossed the little bridge over the river. She swore he had been with them when they stopped to dip their toes into the water. She swore he had been with them when they stopped at the bathrooms. She also swore that she couldn't be certain after they had passed the picnic area and started heading back to their car. I don't remember much after the picnic area, if I'm being honest, she said, her dreamy voice at odds with her tearful demeanor of a moment before. I'd been walking along, listening to something, and for a moment it was almost like I was hearing my mom talk to me. I know how that sounds, but I'm telling you that I could almost hear her voice. Her husband had said something similar, though not quite the same. He could swear he heard people whispering just out of sight, like they were sitting in the woods and discussing important matters. He described it like the scene in The Hobbit, where the dwarves keep interrupting the elves' party. He could hear them, but he knew that if he went to investigate, they would all just melt away and reappear somewhere else. Regardless, neither of them could say when little Marcus had left their side, but he was gone now, and they wanted him found. John stayed with the parents while the forest was searched. He had set up a little command center near the visitor center and was directing volunteers from there. Mr. Lorraine had gone out to help them at the start, but by sunset, he was back at the tent and sitting with his wife. The two were holding each other, both praying quietly as they waited for their son to return. They were upset, but John had yet to see them cry. They were afraid, but they didn't look overly fearful. He would have thought they'd be in shock, except that they kept looking into the forest as if someone were calling to them before going back to their prayers. "This isn't good," John said under his breath. "You don't say," Wayne had said, looking at the parents as he pitched his voice low. "Be as glib as you want, but Marcus Lorraine's disappearance doesn't look good." Wayne pulled him aside out of earshot of the grieving parents so that they could talk. "Do you have any idea how many kids go missing in the national park every year? Do you know how many theme parks lose kids without the help of creeps? Kids wander off, John. Probably find him asleep under a tree somewhere." They did not find him asleep under a tree somewhere. They didn't find him at all, as it happened. Marcus was the 15th person to go missing in the park that year, but he wasn't the last. "We've had hundreds more pre-orders for the upcoming acreage. We'll sell the plots as quickly as they become available. It's almost like we're printing money." John was glad that Wayne had forgotten about the kid so easily, but John found it a little more difficult. He remembered each of the names, each a civil suit their families tried to file before his lawyers shut them down, and he supposed he probably always would. Wayne went on talking, but John couldn't take his eyes off the trees. Their sway was so hypnotic. Maybe this was why people kept going missing. That, or the whispering that he heard sometimes. He could even hear it a little up here, but it was always worse when he was on the grounds. It was like a slithering little voice that wormed its way into his ears, begging him to come and join the others who had already come to this place. And why not, he thought. They all seemed to have found peace here. Everyone seemed to find peace here. Maybe that was why so many of them came here too. "How's your mom?" Wayne asked suddenly, and the question jarred him back to reality. "Some days better, some days worse. She's fading, but she's going out slowly." "Will you plant her here too when the time comes?" Wayne asked, the question sounding uneasy. "I've saved her a spot from the very start," John said, looking at a place near the base of the tower. "I grew this forest for her, after all." Wayne excused himself after a little more small talk, but John stood there and watched the trees sway. Who wouldn't want to be laid to rest in such a peaceful place? It's an honor to stand here and ring in a year since the opening of Yomite Pines Memorial Forest. The crowd applauded excitedly, but as John stood looking out over them, all he could hear was the wind through the trees beyond them. They were all pines here at Yomite Pines, somehow or another. Mighty pines that grew lush and deep green in the hardy soil. In about a year, they had grown past the projections put forth at the start, and John now stood beneath towering trees that had been little more than half-grown saplings 2 years ago when he'd begun planting. He shuddered a little as something else rustled against his subconscious, but he put it aside, like he always did. It was just nerves, after all, just like the dreams. "I'm proud to say we've incorporated another 100 acres, 50 of which has been donated by the North American Wildlife Foundation to help with the deforestation efforts. Of those new 100 acres, we have already filled 50 of them with fresh growth and new remains. The Yomite Pines Memorial Forest will soon be a forest stretching across the newly reclaimed land, and our world will be better for it." The applause from the crowd was much more enthusiastic than they had been last time. The thought of a forest of dead people had been a little sickening, a little spooky too, but now they were behind him. This reforestation project was a big hit, and people were signing up for plots in the hundreds. Though Yomite Pines might be a big hit with the people, John was beginning to have reservations about the project. It had been 6 months since Marcus had disappeared, and now his mother and father were also missing. John had once liked to stroll out here, just taking it all in and soaking in the peaceful landscape he had created. He had been on one such walk about 2 weeks after Marcus had gone missing, when he had seen Mrs. Lorraine walking down the path towards him. Walking might have been a stretch. Shelley Lorraine was wobbling like a drunk, and as she came towards him, she looked as if she were barely in the world. He called out to her, asking how she was doing and if there was any news on Marcus, but it took 3 such calls for her to look up and acknowledge him. "Huh?" she finally said, shaking her head as if she'd been sleepwalking. "Oh, Mr. Yomite, She seemed to mumble through what she was before answering. "As well as I can be, I suppose." "Did you come to look for Marcus?" he asked, wondering why she was here if she was still looking for her son. The whole park had been searched from border to border, but no sign of the kid had been found. It was as if the ground had simply swallowed him up and left nothing behind. They had moved on to the surrounding scrublands, but John was certain that he had seen the mother in the park more than once. The father had come in once as well, but that was the last time that John had seen him. He hadn't come back out again after that, and John supposed he was doing better than his wife. Here she was, high or drunk or both, and John would have to tell security to keep an eye on her. "Yes," she said, looking off into the trees as if someone had called her. "Yes, it's like I can hear him when I'm here. He keeps calling for me, and keep hoping I'll find him. Excuse me, she said, and stepped into the tree line as she went off into the towering gravestones that surrounded them. That was the last time that John had seen her. The last time that anyone had seen her, actually. The whole family had disappeared, and Scott, the security guy over the park, actually showed him the security footage of Mr. Lorraine coming in but never leaving. He asked John what he wanted to do with it, and John had told him not to tell anybody about it. He must have left in a crowd, and we missed him. There's no reason to tell anyone about this. It was a tragedy, after all, but as guilty as John felt, he couldn't have something like this sabotaged by one family. This was his chance to make amends for some of the things he had done, to make amends to the one person whose opinion mattered to him. That was the last anyone spoke of the Lorraines, but it wasn't the last John thought of them. The new acreage will be open to the public next year, once the new growth has had time to get its roots. Until then, I invite all of you to enjoy Yeomite Park in its fullest. They applauded again, disappearing as John waved his way off stage. Wayne was waiting for him off stage too, all smiles. Maybe it was because he was an accountant, but as long as the money flowed, Wayne was happy. Great speech, he said, walking beside John as the two made their way towards the tower. John watched as many of the people seated there took up walking through the park, looking in awe at the trees that had been grown from human compost. We shouldn't be letting people just walk around the park anymore, John said suddenly. It's too dangerous. Wayne looked confused, but as John finished, he grinned like a shot fox. How else do you intend to pay for park services and expansion? He said, smiling woodenly. Maybe it shouldn't be expanded. It shouldn't be open to the public either. No one picnics in a graveyard. No one goes birdwatching at the cemetery. The longer we let them walk the paths of Yeomite pines, the more of them will go missing. We're up to 20 this year, and it's probably more like twice that number. Something's happening here. You're too money-hungry to see it, John said, now real emotion in his voice. Wayne looked like he wanted to say something cutting, but he contented himself with a lame, says the billionaire tech mogul. John rounded on him. This has nothing to do with money, nothing to do with fame or glory either. I've spent years killing this planet with my selfish ventures, and now it's time to give back. The planet deserves a chance to heal, and I intend to give it that. Yeomite Pines will sweep as far as I can push it, an untouchable beauty that will heal the world. But there's no reason that people should be free to wander here. The door to his car was open, and he climbed in as he gave Wayne one final withering look. I want to close the grounds by the start of next month. I don't care what it costs. Make it happen. Wayne watched him go, and he sighed as he watched him get smaller in the rearview mirror. John felt more at ease as he drove off. The incessant whispering was finally cut off, and that was good because it was getting to be more than he could take. Every time he came out to the pines, it got worse, but John still found himself drawn to the place. John dreamed about it most every night, and sometimes he woke up with dirty feet or muddy shoes at the foot of his bed. John didn't live too far from the park, but it was still 5 miles or more. Was he walking there in the middle of the night? Surely he wasn't driving, but what other option could there be? In his dreams, he walked amongst the trees, hearing the voices on the wind. In his dreams, he saw people walking amongst those trees, people who were as thin as fruit skins. They wanted him to join them, to come and be a part of them, and John found it harder and harder to ignore their call the longer it went on. He knew that one day he'd have to go to them, but until then, he still had work to do. This was a gift to his mother, after all, the woman who had been so disappointed with his actions, but had never stopped loving him. This was a final gift to her before she left the world forever. This was the last thing that he could do to make amends. The valet parked his car as he pulled up to the hospital, and as he rode the elevator up to the 7th floor, he wondered what state he would find her in today. She'd been getting weaker as the cancer ate at her, and it seemed unfair that it should be something like that would take his mother from the world. She who had marched against deforestation, who had gone to sit-ins for cleaner oceans and for endangered species, the woman who had loved the earth with all that she had, was going to be taken from it by something as mundane as cancer. His mother was going to be eaten alive by something that none of his money could do anything about, and John hated that more than anything. He came in to find her napping, but she opened her eyes as he took her hand and smiled at him. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" he asked, trying not to cry, but knowing that his eyes were leaking. "Like I'm dying," she said, smiling despite herself. "Just not fast enough for the cancer's liking. We added another 100 acres to the park today. The ceremony was great. I wish you could have been there." "Me too," she said, her eyes drooping. She was so tired these days, so easily tapped out. "Mom, am I doing the right thing here? I know this is helping the environment, helping the world, but is it the right thing?" His mother smiled, her face sad but content. "I can't tell you that, dear. We all have to decide what's right and wrong for ourselves. I only want to do what would make you proud of me, what would make you proud to have me as a son." John was crying, really having a good boo-hoo, but he didn't care who saw it as he pressed his face against her shoulder. "Well," she said, laughing hoarsely, "then I'm glad my pain could be useful for something." He just sat there with her, the two of them enjoying the other's company. John had saved her a place for after she was gone, a place where she could be at peace within the earth. Her final good deed for the planet she loved so much. She would grow within the heart of the park, likely the largest tree in the park when she was done. She would rise above all the others, dwarfing all the pines as she rose for the sky. Till then, however, he would mourn her, one day at a time. He was running, the soil mashing between his toes as he went. The trees rose up around him, their voices high and beautiful. They called to him as he ran, asking why he was fleeing from them. They could bring him peace, too. They could make him complete within the soil. The moon was a ghostly sickle over top of him, and as he ran over the muddy ground of the park, his park, he felt more and more lost. He had built this place, had designed the layout, and it was unthinkable that he should be unable to find his way. This was a dream anyway, he told himself. He was dreaming all this, no matter how much dirt he found on his sheets in the morning. These were all just nightmares, regardless of the filth he found at the bottom of his feet. Nothing here could hurt him, nothing could really get him, but that did little to hamper his fear as he ran. "Come to us, John. Come find peace in the soil." His spine prickled. Had that been Miss Lorraine? He took turns at random, his feet feeling heavy the further he went into the park as it sucked at him. The ground was hungry, and now it wanted him to go along with the others it had taken. He didn't understand how it could still be hungry, but it ate greedily as he sank more and more of them into the soil. Now it wanted him too, and as his feet came onto the sidewalk, he breathed a sigh of relief. The ground couldn't get him on the sidewalk. At least he didn't think so. He seemed to come back to himself as that thought came to him, and he realized this may not be a dream. Suddenly he was standing on the sidewalk, wearing his comfortable sleep pants and his sleeveless t-shirt, staring at the whispering sea of trees. He'd found himself here before, wondering how he had gotten here, and as he reached for his phone, he realized it wasn't in his pocket. It wouldn't be, would it? It'd be on his nightstand, right where he'd left it. He looked at the tower and was thankful that he'd paid for night security. He started walking towards the edifice, preparing to answer some questions yet again. "This is starting to become a problem, John." Wayne was pacing around his office in the tower as John sat drinking coffee in his night clothes. Scott had called Wayne for some reason, and John would have to have a word with him about that later. John signed the paychecks around here, not his accountant and VP of sales. Scott was likely worried that John was having a break from reality. John realized that didn't change matters, though. This was still John's project, and he was in charge. If the shareholders find out about this is going to be bad. John laughed. Shareholders? What shareholders? This project is being bankrolled by me and me alone. Wayne shook his head. I'm not talking about the park, John. I'm talking about the shareholders in your other companies. If they find out that you're wandering around your memorial garden every night, they might worry that you're losing it. John shrugged. Let them think what they want. This is more important than anything else. Wayne looked at him then like he might be crazy. Talk like that's gonna bankrupt you. I know you're torn up about your mother, John, but this isn't the time to give up. John didn't say anything for a little while, staring at the coffee as it sloshed in his cup. I don't know if I want to add more acreage to this place. I don't know if I want people here or not. The only thing I do know is that this work is important to the planet, if not the people, and it needs to continue. Wayne left not long after that, and John was left to stare into his cup and wonder. Despite what he had told Wayne, he added another 100 acres to the park. Despite what he had told Wayne, the people still came to the park. They had a man-made lake now, 3 picnic areas, and enough parking for everyone buried here and then some. They also added nearly 30 missing patrons to the tally, putting them at around 60. There had been many searches of the grounds, but no one had ever been found. It had become quite a mystery, and as John drove into the park, he grimaced at the graffiti on the welcome sign. People kept spray painting "Whispering" over Yomite on the sign, and John had replaced it several times already. He'd have to get Scott to check the cameras again, though he found the name extremely appropriate. John's dreams had far from abated, and he rolled his window up as the whispering tried to find its way to him again. They beseeched him to come to them, to join them, and John didn't know how long he could resist them. The dreams were drawing him out here nightly, and he'd started waking up in the park more often than not. It was becoming more and more apparent that he was simply walking here at night, and there didn't seem to be any way to stop that from happening. Lately, however, the calls had been in a voice that he couldn't refuse. He walked into the park, sliding in his AirPods as he came through the gate, and the whispering intensified. It really was a beautiful place. The pines had come in nicely, and they were growing tall and healthy. They stretched out from the gate now, a mighty forest that had risen from nothing, and he was proud of his work. He was haunted by that work too, but it didn't stop him from being proud of it. He had accomplished much in the 2 years since starting, but there was still so much work left to do. He stopped by one of the trees, the one near the base of the tower, and looked down at the new growth already poking its way through the soil. "Hey, Mom. Looking good," he whispered. She had passed about 3 months ago, not long after his conversation in her hospital room. She had been laid to rest in the park, his last gift to her, and the placard he had put up in front of her tree was the only real allocation for grave markers. Everyone else had a small number so their loved ones could find them, but his mother would only be important to him, and he knew that. She had been his last family, the only surviving piece, and now it was down to him to mourn her. When she had joined his dreams, adding her voice to the chorus, he didn't know how much longer he'd be able to hold out. Wayne was waiting for him when he got to the top of the tower, holding up the plans for the latest expansion. "We just got approval for another 100 acres. We should have it filled before June, and then the next 100 before this time next year, I guess. How much would it take to get another 1,000 acres? Wayne's eyes went a little wild. I mean, some of it would be available through government grants, but the cost would be steep. Make it happen. I don't care what it costs. Wayne looked at him oddly. You feeling okay? You're not planning on doing anything drastic, are you? He seemed to have noticed how close John was standing to the window. John couldn't exactly blame him for his concern. John had been feeling a little hinky, as his mom had been wont to say, and he wasn't sure what to do about it, or what he might do about it. I'll get the papers drawn up, Wayne said, rolling up the survey charts. I talked with Scott about the sign, too. As usual, they can't find anything on the cameras to blame it on. Just kids out for a little helling, I guess. John nodded, but it's pretty clear that Wayne couldn't hear the whispers. He didn't get it. Probably never would. He was the perfect one to run something like this, though he would never understand the importance of it, or the horror. The nights John had spent out here had shown him where the missing people were going, had shown him his own fate as well. The whispering would get him one of these nights. It was only a matter of time. John was tired, but the terror made his legs move as the mud sucked at his every step. Maybe tonight was the night. Maybe this would be the night they got him. Maybe this was the night he became a part of Whispering Pines. Even the name had slunk into his consciousness. It was fitting, too fitting. He could no more outrun it than he could the ground that sucked at his feet. Suddenly the ground did a little more than pull, and John was up to his thighs in the hungry muck. Beneath the soil he could feel the strong grip of searching vines and realized that if he didn't start fighting now, the jig would be up. He yanked and tugged, his strong runner's legs feeling ineffective in the muck. He was losing ground, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and when the paved path came into view, he waited like a drowning man. The roots gripped at him, dragging him back, but John pulled onward, working for the shore. Suddenly, the dirt was up to his hips, and he was wading through the fresh mud. He wasn't going to make it, he thought. The roots would get him, the ground would take him, and he'd be with the dead. One of his nails tore up painfully as he grasped the sidewalk, but he pulled himself up nonetheless. He limped a little as he walked towards the tower, one of his ankles having twisted a little as the root grabbed at him. John's steps weren't just heavy because of the ankle, though. John hadn't gotten a good night's sleep since he opened this damn place. He was exhausted, living off cat naps in his office, or the 4 or 5 hours he snatched a night. John was used to weird sleep schedules, and he had kept strange hours throughout college, but as he got older, it became harder to maintain. He didn't know how much longer he could last like this, and as he came to a familiar placard, he stopped in front of it. His mother's tree was larger than it had any right to be. Seemed larger than it had been this morning, in fact, and the concrete bit at his knees as he dropped down before it. "Mom," he said, tears running down his face. "Mom, I don't know how much longer I can do this. I'm so tired. I want to rest. I want to..." When his mother's voice shuddered against him, like the caress of a bird's wing, he looked up and saw her. She was lovely, bedecked in leaves and green, the queen of summer in all her glory. When she reached down to touch his face, her hands felt like flowers against his skin. He closed his eyes as he leaned into her touch, her words like summer sun on his skin. "You've done your best, John. Come, rest with us." John nodded, pitching forward as the earth swallowed him up. He should have been terrified, but the embrace felt almost womb-like. It felt so natural, like coming home, and John breathed in a lungful of soil as the darkness enveloped him. "Welcome home," his mother said, and John felt at home. It's my tremendous pleasure to announce the expansion of Whispering Pines Memorial Forest. The park has become less of a memorial and more of a forest in its own right now, and I hope someday to see hundreds of forests like it, instead of useless granite slabs that do nothing but take up space. I know if my friend, John Yomite, or his mother, Terry Yomite, could see how this project had expanded, they would be very proud of the work we've achieved here. I've watched this garden grow into a mighty forest, and I couldn't be more proud to be a part of it. John watched as Wayne spoke to the crowd, telling them about the new backer who was interested in what they were doing here. John understood the words he said, things like the woman's name, Titania Thurston, the Green Society, and Kashmir Botanical Gardens, but they didn't mean anything to him. If someone was interested in his idea, that was good. If they let the forest rot, he supposed that was okay too. John was part of the Whispering Pines woods now, and he supposed that others would be too, very soon. Being a tree was probably the best thing he'd ever experienced, and he was eager to share it with others. Wayne still couldn't hear him, but he would, someday. Some of those in the crowd could clearly hear him, and they'd likely join him too, someday. John had time after all. He certainly wasn't going anywhere. I am a murderer. I'm responsible for the deaths of 75 within 2 weeks. I've stabbed men to death, rendered bodies to ash, killed children in the womb, and even drowned whole ships at sea. I've changed the fate of kingdoms and seen to it that uncharted planets remained unfound. I would likely be the most prolific serial killer in the United States, if not for one problem. The police claim that if murdering fictional characters was a crime, they'd have to jail Stephen King and George R. for multiple life sentences. They say this as they laugh me out of the police station. They think it's a joke, or that maybe I'm not right in my head. But I can assure you, I'm as right as I've ever been. I listened to them tell their stories for years, and I've heard them scream when I end their lives. I'm a murderer, pure and simple, and their blood is on my hands. You're probably reading this, though, and thinking that I'm ready for the rubber room. Let me start from the beginning. I've always been a creative mind. When I was younger, I could hear them whisper to me about their homes, their verdant green kingdoms, their sterile, majestic spaceships, the feel of rolling decks beneath their feet, and so much more. It manifested in my games, and my school friends would always gather around to see what today's adventure would be. We traveled the cosmos, fought wars between elves and men, and roamed imaginary prairies as we hunted wrongdoers on horseback. As I grew older, the voices grew louder, more insistent, and their stories became my stories. I wrote about the kingdoms of my youth, the adventures of my childhood, and by the time I was 20, I had 5 books published, even one on the New York Times bestseller list. As I grew, so grew my fame. My writing was prolific, and all the while the voices told me their stories. I took my readers to fantastic places, and their patronage allowed me to live quite well. By the time I was 30, I had a home and a family and enough published work to fill a bookshelf. That's when the problems started. It all started with Aberdeen Price, dashing archaeologist adventure. He told me of his next adventure, a trip to the city of Bone. However, I was working on something else at the time, and didn't want to divert efforts away from my current project. So I wrote some notes and promised myself I would sit down and give him some time when I was done. This apparently wasn't good enough for Aberdeen. He came every night in my dreams and told me his story over and over and over again, until finally, I just couldn't take it anymore. I stopped what I was doing and diverted all my attention to writing his next book. It was a hit, a bestseller, and the biggest mistake of my life. You see, this showed the voices that they could get what they wanted by badgering me. Every night from that night on, they would come to me and tell me their stories, each overlapping the other, until I just couldn't take it anymore. The kingdom of Verdant Green was once at the mercy of the dark wizard Zormuth. His evil armies threatened to scanners once more alert Kevin Gorel that he is nearing his destination. The dark planet Zephyr rises from the darkness of space as he see the island of Katmandil off the starboard side of Elizabeth's Folly. The shore is quiet, but Captain Cree can once again see the natives amongst the trees as he hears his quarry. The elusive Dr. Burton will strike again this night, and I will be ready to... Their voices towered in my mind like the screams of children as they tried to make themselves heard. That was my first mental breakdown, and my worst. My wife arrived home in time to save me from bleeding to death. They put me in an institution for 3 weeks after that. Lisa thought it was all the strain of my busy writing schedule. The strain of writing so much must have just become too much for you, she said, as she stood by my bedside and looked down with pity for her poor, brilliant husband. She had no idea. The worst part wasn't the IVs or the sedatives, the shitty TV, or the staying in a room for 24 hours a day, the sounds of sorrow from down the hall, even the constant itching from the healing cuts on my arms. It was the week and a half I spent with my hands in restraints. Without my hands, I couldn't write. Without writing, there was no way to stop the shrieking harpies in my brain from driving me insane. It took me a while to convince them that writing was a kind of therapy for me. The battle was made all the harder by my wife's constant arguments about how the writing had put me here in the first place. After a week and a half of no change, they had begun to see that I might be making some sense. I began to write again, and the changes were noticeable. I started sleeping, became less hostile, finished my meals, and a month later I was ready to go home. The voices started ramping up again almost immediately. By this point in my career, I had 7 stories running on and off. That's a lot of voices trying to be heard. I tried to keep up with them, but I could feel my sanity slipping again as they screamed for my attention day and night. By my 2nd week home, my wife was ready to have me committed all over again. I'd stop sleeping and would lock myself in my study for days to make the voices stop for even a few minutes. That was when my first murder took place. That's not to say that no one had ever died in my stories. Characters die in stories, that's the nature of storytelling. But this was the first time I'd ever deviated from the path set forward by the voices. Detective Sam Umbridge was coming to the climactic end of his latest crime novel, and the shootout with the killer was becoming heated. I had meant to write that Dario West, the antagonist of the novel, was struck by Sam's bullet as he leaned around the doorframe. Before I knew what I'd done, though, I had written the death of beloved gumshoe Sam Umbridge instead. I had moved on to the next sentence before I caught my error, but it was too late by then. He died in my head with a gut-wrenching scream, and just like that, his voice was mercifully silent. For a moment, all the voices were silent. It was as though they had all seen what I had done in my manic state. I cleaned up the draft a little bit before sending it off. Sam and Dario had killed each other in the shootout, and Sam had died victorious. Fans hated that Detective Sam Umbridge would never make another appearance on their shelves, but they accepted it. The end was widely praised by fans and critics alike, an all-around success. My agent even called to congratulate me on the climax of a much-beloved series, and asked if everything was going all right with me. Last time we talked, you sounded as though you were a little shell-shocked. I guess I wasn't shocked now that I think of it. The process really made me think. Why not kill what was driving me crazy? I didn't have to kill them all, just enough of them to make the voices quiet down a little. Like any prolific serial killer will tell you, it's hard to stop once you've started. Before I quite realized what I'd done, I'd ended them all. I ended my 8-book fantasy series with the death of the entire court and the eventual fall of the protagonist in his order. I watched as Kelvern Gorel flew his ship and crew into the phantom night where certain doom awaited, and he would never be heard from again. After sinking the ship of his arch-rival, I had the Spanish Armada sink Elizabeth's Folly with all hands aboard, while Captain Cree floated atop the waves after taking a sword to the belly. I dropped a tomb on the head of Aberdeen Price, the one who had started my descent, and made the ruins he was exploring his own tomb in turn. I killed them all, one by one, and the fans were livid. How could you just kill them? Why wouldn't you simply end the series on a high note? Why did they all have to die? I toyed with the idea of ending their series, but I knew that it wouldn't work the moment I thought of it. They were never my stories in the end. They were only my stories to tell. If I left them alive, they would always want one more adventure. Killing them was all I could do to stop my descent into madness. And as I lay down to sleep that night, I felt myself smile at the thought of my long-awaited sleep. It never came. I've been staring at my sleeping wife for the past 7 hours as I keep court with the whispering dead. Their spirits are unwilling to die, the part of my soul I put inside them reluctant to be put to rest. It's only now that I see the folly of my actions. The dead, you see, are not to be satiated with adventures or the continuing joy of existence. They moan, they wail, they bemoan the lives and the loves that were taken from them. At first, it was only for me that I wept. Now I see that this curse won't end with me. You see, I was watching my daughter as she played in the park yesterday. She played in the sandbox, her dolls and her brother's action figures out on an adventure of her own creation. I watched her going about her games of make-believe as I sat in a daze. When I asked her about it over lunch, she told me a story about knights and castles, people hunting for dragons, and brave warriors protecting those in need from harm. It was a story just like the ones I had made up as a kid. The kingdom was similar to the one I had left in ashes. I beg you, anyone out there who hears the whispers, don't pass the gift to others. It must end with us, and never darken the mind again. I must keep my own vigil now. I must watch my own daughter now, before the madness takes hold. I can't let the whispers have her too, even if it means the death of another of my creations. I won't let the madness have her.
"Yeah, it's just me here tonight," I said as I washed up a few dishes. The darkness outside seemed held at bay by the big floodlight on the pole. The forest surrounding our little cabin looked like a green wave that was preparing to swallow our circle of humanity up forever, and it was only thanks to that 120-watt bulb that we were saved. I had the phone pressed against my ear, and I laughed as my boyfriend said something funny. The phone slipped towards the soapy water, and I caught it just in time as something scratched at the door again. "What?" "Nah, they haven't come home yet. Uncle Ricky doesn't usually like to be out in the woods after dark." I opened the back door as another loud scratch came from it, and Benji walked in. The mutt had been with our family for years, and as he lumbered in, he wagged his tail and gave me a big doggy grin. I wrinkled my nose with disgust when I noticed that he'd been rolling in something. There was red-brown crust all over his right side, and at first I mistook it for blood. When I saw he wasn't limping, though, I figured it was just mud, or worse, blood off of some carcass he'd rolled around in the woods. I started after him as he made his way towards the laundry room where his food bowls were, my boyfriend prattling away in my ear. "Rick, I'm gonna have to call you back," I said, making my way towards the laundry room before Benji could roll around on the clean laundry. "Everything okay, babe?" "Yeah, but Benji rolled in something, and I don't want him to get it all over the house." "Okay, well, stay safe. Love you. Love you too, Rick. See you tomorrow." I hung up the phone and took a step towards the laundry room. I had just reached for the bristle brush by the sink when my phone blared from the countertop. I turned away from Benji and walked towards the phone, checking the caller ID to see who it was. Brad's smiling face was plastered across the screen, and I picked it up on the third ring. I figured it would be them telling me they were on their way and running late. I didn't get 3 words out, however, before I was immediately buffeted by a wall of static and Brad's frantic voice yelling as he cut in and out. I held the phone a little away from my ear, like it might explode. "Hello? Oh God, thank God, Rach. I need you to call the sheriff right now." His tone was equal parts terror and fury, and I was immediately worried. "What happened? Is everything okay?" "Uncle Ricky's hurt pretty bad, and Dad's not in the best shape either. Dad says to call the sheriff and get an ambulance. Lock the door until we get there." "Brad, what happened? Do it, Rachel. We'll be there in 5 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone until we get there." Then he hung up on me, and I was left looking at the silent brick. I tried the sheriff's office, but the phone just rang and rang before connecting me with static. The phone number for the ambulance did the same, and by this point, I was starting to get scared. Was there a problem with the phones in town? Had some disaster happened out in the woods that spilled over into town? As I went to lock the door, I saw the familiar headlights of Dad's old pickup coming up the driveway. I flung it open instead and went to help them. Dad came out of the back, hoisting Uncle Ricky under the arm, and Brad hopped out of the driver's seat and ran over to help him. Uncle Ricky hung limply between them, and I could see at a glance that he was not in good shape. His flannel shirt and jeans were covered in blood, and though it was hard to tell, I thought his left arm might be gone. Dad was covered in blood too, but it looked like some of it might be Uncle Rick's. He had 4 long claw marks running through his left eye, and it was swelling too badly for me to tell if the eye still worked. Brad shouted at me to get the door, and I complied as all 3 of them came running into the living room. In the light, it was easy to tell how bad Uncle Rick was. His arm was gone, the sleeve had been used to make a tourniquet around the stump, and his breathing was shallow as he lay on the couch in a state of unconsciousness. Brad said something about getting back for the guns, but Dad shut him down and sent us both to lock the doors. After the house was secure, Dad asked me if I'd called the sheriff or the ambulance. I told him about the strange static, and he swore loudly as he took his own cell phone out of his pocket. He dialed a number, and I could tell by his face that he was getting the same result. Finally, he swore and threw the phone against the wall. "I guess we're on our own," he said, and it was the most hopeless sound I'd ever heard come out of my daddy. Even when Mama died, he'd still kept a strong face on for us. "What's going on? What happened to Uncle Rick?" I asked. Dad looked over at Brad, and after a silent conference, Dad started to tell it. "We'd been hunting for most of the day. We hadn't caught a damn thing. Something was scaring the game off. We heard it walking around a few times and thought it was a bear. Your Uncle Rick said it smelled like a bear. So when the sun started going down, we decided it was time to pack it in. We started getting everything together. Right out of the blue, a doe steps out in the meadow. She looked around real skittish-like and starts cropping grass real quick. She clearly smelled whatever had been making that noise all day, but the deer has to eat, and she started filling her belly as quickly as she could. Your uncle sighted her up and dropped her real easy, and we figured at least we'd have one thing to show for our efforts. No sooner did we get to the edge of the meadow when a big old something comes crashing out. It grabbed our deer and bolted back into the woods like a bat out of hell. It kind of looked like a bear, I guess. The sun was setting and it was hard to tell, but it moved quicker than any bear I'd ever seen. Brad and I were just going to let it go, but Rick was mad as I'd ever seen him. He tore off after it, saying he was going to take that thing home instead. So we follow him, not wanting to leave him in the woods alone after dark, and we chased this thing into its cave. At that point, I was sure it was a bear, so we go creeping in, trying to surprise it. As the sun sets behind us, we see this thing hunkered over the deer, and it weren't no bear. It's wolfing at the deer, just slurping down big mouthfuls, and Rick gets real pale and starts gibbering about how it's the thing that we saw when we were kids. "Wait," I interrupted, you've seen this thing before?" Dad looked perturbed, but nodded. "Yeah, that's why Rick hated to go into the woods after dark. When we were teenagers, we were up in a stand hunting deer. Rick sights one before sunset, and he drops it, much like we had tonight. We're about to go get it when this big thing comes out of the woods and starts wolfing it down right there in the meadow. Well, you know your Uncle Rick. He always had a temper. So he pops off a shot at it. Hits it too, but that don't do nothing but piss it off. It comes roaring and charging up to the bottom of our tree and starts clawing and pushing until it topples it over. We jump out just as it hits the ground and just go tearing off running for the truck." "And that was what you saw today?" "Well," Dad hedged, "it was almost dark when we shot the deer, and we never got a good look at it. All I know is that's what chased us out of the woods, and Rick wouldn't go hunting with us for the next 3 years after that." He paused for a minute to make sure I was out of questions before continuing his story. "So with Rick gibbering, this thing looks up and sees us. I swear to you that it came up on its hind legs and walked like a man as it ran at us. Rick pops a shot off, probably just panic fire, but it just shrugs it off and lands on him. I saw his arm, rifle and all, go into its mouth, and I heard it crunch as it bit it clean off. Rick starts screaming, and we all start yelling. Before it can finish him off, though, Brad and I pepper it 4 or 5 times with buckshot. It must have dazed it because it rolled off a rick with a loud shriek and stumbled back towards the cave. It sounded like a man screaming, Brad said, and Dad nodded before going on. It starts flailing around in pain, and we grabbed Rick and start dragging him back towards the truck. This thing came after us, and it sounded like it was crashing through the trees the whole way. We couldn't move very fast. Each of us had an arm under Rick as we drug him along, and I swear it would have had us if it hadn't been for Benji. My blood suddenly ran cold. Benji? Yeah, poor little guy. He's been with us the whole time. He didn't seem to want anything to do with that thing, but when it jumped on us again and raked my face, he started growling and lunges right at it. I hear them tearing and snarling at each other, and we just hightailed it back to the truck. It's a wonder we ever found it in the dark. Poor old Benji. He sacrificed himself so we could get away. Both Brad and my dad looked forlorn, but I just shook my head. No, he didn't. He's right here. Dad gave me a funny look. What are you talking about? He came wandering in not long before you guys did. That's when I remembered the blood on his fur. There was no way he could outrun the truck. Hell, the only reason I hadn't questioned it was because I had forgotten he had gone with him. I looked back towards the kitchen door, and it creaked open as Benji's friendly grin poked through the gap. He strolled into the living room, his fur still a mess of blood and mud, and glanced around the room as his tail wagged and his big old doggy smile stretched across his face. When he stepped up on his hind legs, I thought for sure I was dreaming. Benji leapt across the living room, and when he hit the couch, he was no longer the cuddly mutt we'd all come to love. He was 200 pounds of sleek black fur and raking claws that reduced my family to a spray of blood and screams of mercy. I fell back from the scene, covering my eyes with my hands to block it all out. I could still hear every bone-wrenching yank, every blood-splattering swipe, and every watery gurgle as my family had their throats torn out. I was numb. My mind shrank away from the scene before me as I backpedaled until my back hit the wall of the cabin. I curled my knees up to my chest and put my head against my knees as I sank to the floor and waited for it to be over. I didn't care at that moment whether I lived or died. I only wanted it to end. I could feel myself crying as the living room became a killing field. And when it finally ended, I could hear the overpowering bray of my explosive sobs. My sobs stopped when I heard heavy footsteps walking towards me. I didn't look up. I didn't want to look up. But when the creature's hot breath puffed against the top of my head, I pulled my face away from my knees despite myself. His blood-smeared face was inches from mine, and I quickly buried my face against my knees again. It was leaning over me, my family's blood pattering onto my skin, and it was all I could do not to pass out from terror. We stayed like that for several minutes, until I couldn't take it anymore. I lifted my head and looked at this semi-feline face and asked the question, Why haven't you killed me yet? His voice was high, like a bee that's been caught in a jar, and it hurt my ears to listen to him. Because you helped me. For that favor, I will give you a favor in return. Leave my woods before sunset tomorrow, and I will allow you to continue to exist. Stay, and you will share the fate of your kin. Then he turned and walked out of the house on 2 legs. I was gone before the sun came up. I threw my clothes in a bag, took the pickup my brother had been careless enough to leave the keys in, and drove. My phone rang a few times, but I ignored it. The hardest was when Aunt Clara called, but after 3 days, even she stopped calling. They likely assumed I was dead too. I sold the truck before I left the state and haven't looked back. I drove until I couldn't see the forest anymore. I drove until I couldn't see 3 trees grouped close enough to obscure anything. And when the desert stretched out before me, I finally stopped. I'll make my life here now. I have no intention of ever leaving the desert again. I don't know what forest this creature calls its own, and I never want to find out.
Did anyone else become a participant in the social experiment known as Flat Stanley? I went to elementary school in the mid-90s, 95 to 2001, and I was in the 3rd grade when our teacher announced that we would be taking part in the Flat Stanley Project. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept, Flat Stanley was a series of books about a flat kid who goes on all kinds of weird adventures to famous places. New York, the Grand Canyon, France, Australia. This guy went everywhere and was like a flat version of Curious George. We started reading them in class, making them part of our English hour, and one day, Mrs. Gazel told us that we were going to have a contest. Today's English lesson is to create your own Flat Stanley. It can look however you want, but the winner of the contest will get 3 prizes from the prize basket, and will be the class's Flat Stanley that we send into the world to participate in the Flat Stanley Project. We were all excited. This was a chance to see our work in pictures that would come back, not to mention get some cool stuff out of the prize basket. We all drew out our own concepts for Flat Stanley and set to work coloring and designing him. My Flat Stanley was a spy, wearing a big trench coat and a wide hat and carrying binoculars. He wore his regular clothes under it, and he just looked so goofy that I thought I had a real chance of winning. My friend Todd laughed when he glanced over at it, telling me it was cool. His Flat Stanley was a football player for the Georgia Bulldogs, his favorite team, and I thought his Flat Stanley looked cool too. So when the class voted on the displayed Stanleys, I figured Kaylee's Flat Stanley would win. It had a sparkly tiara and a ball gown she had made with felt. That was the one that I voted for, at least, since you couldn't vote for your own. And if not hers, I figured Matt's would win. His Flat Stanley was a truck driver, complete with a net hat and a sleeveless t-shirt, and he'd put a lot of work into it. I knew some kids might find mine funny, but I never figured I stood a chance. I hadn't used any special materials or done anything really innovative, and I figured I'd hang him in my room when I got home. So when Miss Gazel announced that my Flat Stanley had won, I was shocked. I went home that night with a new bounce ball, a pocket-sized Stretch Armstrong, and an eraser shaped like a Pikachu. I also went home to tell my mom that I had won the contest and that my Flat Stanley would be going out to other schools and other places, so we could get pictures back and see all the cool places that he had been. She said that sounded really neat, and we brainstormed where he might end up. Paris, Disneyland, the moon. We both laughed at that one, and maybe even at an Atlanta Braves baseball game. We had a good afternoon thinking about where he might end up, and when Dad got home, he joined us in our daydream. I went to bed that night, thinking about all the cool places Stanley might go, and what we might see when he came back. It started out pretty normal. Mrs. Gazel sent the package out to a school the next town over, and they sent us back pictures a week later. Stanley had been to a volleyball game, an art museum, and finally to a play put on by the class. They sent him up the road to the next school, where Stanley went on a hike, went to the zoo, and then went to a baseball game. It wasn't the Atlanta Braves, but it was a t-ball game, and that was still pretty neat. This went on for a couple of months, Flat Stanley traveling to Texas, New Mexico, California, Idaho, and Kansas. We hung the pictures up, sent out thank you cards, and talked about the places that Flat Stanley had gone. It was a good time, and we used it for our geography class to help us learn the states. It seemed that Flat Stanley was in all our lessons that year. Math, if Flat Stanley travels from Burbank, California to El Paso, Texas, how far has he traveled? Geography, if Flat Stanley is at the Alamo, then where is he? And of course, English, where we read the books and the letters that we got back out loud. It was approaching April when we came to class to find that Miss Gazel wasn't there. We were all pretty bummed because Wednesdays were usually when we got our Flat Stanley letters, and the sub told us that Miss Gazel would talk to us about it when she got back. There was no Flat Stanley that day, and when Miss Gazel came back the following week, we moved on to something else. All the Flat Stanley stuff had disappeared from the class, and its absence was as noticeable as our missing teacher had been. She never told us what had happened, and it was a mystery talked about in hushed tones well into the 4th grade. It would probably still be a mystery if I hadn't decided a decade later to pursue teaching. I'm in my 2nd year of college now, and I've progressed into student teaching. I decided that I wanted to try my hand at being an elementary school teacher, something like 4th or 5th grade, and when they gave me the name of my mentor, I realized I knew her. It was Miss Gazel, my old 3rd grade teacher. She taught 5th grade now, her retirement coming up on the horizon, and she smiled when she realized who I was, giving me a big hug. "Welcome back. I'm glad to see you decided to take up teaching." Her classroom was in the same room her 3rd grade class had been in, and the kids reminded me a lot of me and my friends when we were her students. They were a good group. They were hungry to learn, and they liked her a lot. Miss Gazel was the kind of teacher that kept kids' attention effortlessly, and I hoped it was a skill that I could learn from her. The kiddos in her class took to me pretty quickly, and soon I was teaching classes while Miss Gazel just sat back and observed. Something about being in her class again made me remember my days as a 3rd grader at this school, and that made me think about Flat Stanley. There was nothing like that in her 5th grade class. The kids would have probably thought it was babyish, but it did rekindle some of the mystery I had felt from a decade before. I tried to find a good time to bring it up, but nothing seemed to present itself. Until Friday, on my 2nd week. I was packing up to leave when Miss Gazel offered to take me out for some drinks. I was a little surprised, and she must have noticed because she laughed airily at my look of chagrin. "What, you didn't know teachers drank?" she said, her coat over one arm. I decided to join her and found a small group of other teachers waiting for us when we arrived. Some of them I knew, some of them I didn't, but it turned out that this was a regular thing for them. They drank and talked about their week, complained about some students who were especially difficult, and generally blew off steam. Mrs. Gazel and I sat in the corner, nodding and listening to them, and she smiled at me over the lip of her 4th glass of wine sometime near 11. "I've been sending glowing reviews to your professor," she confided. "You're one of the better student teachers I've ever worked with. I think you're probably a shoo-in to be hired at the end of your training period, and I'll recommend you to the principal myself, if he doesn't extend you a position." I thanked her, sipping my 2nd beer as I took it all in. "Hey, can I ask you something?" I said suddenly. "Neither of us are drunk enough for you to offer me a ride home yet, big fella," she said, snorting into her glass. No, nothing like that. Something always bugged me from my time in your class, and I was wondering if you remember the Flat Stanley project we did." Some of the color fled from her cheeks, and I could swear that she shuddered a little. "I'm surprised you even remember that. It was a long time ago." "Well, everything disappeared from the class so quickly, and when you came back, you never brought it up again. All the books were gone from the class library. All the letters were gone. Everything was missing. I think we talked about it for half of the 4th grade before something else caught our attention." She looked far away for a moment, as if contemplating whether she actually wanted to answer me or not. "I think I need a little air. Would you care to escort me?" I told her I would, and we left amidst a hail of catcalls about cradle robbers and cougars on the prowl. I'd taken her arm, and she was trying to be unbothered by it, but she was stiff and a little unsteady as we walked out onto the patio. Something had her spooked, and I didn't think it was the half-hearted teasing from her peers. When we came outside, she leaned against the railing outside the seating area, looking at the waves as they crashed against the water below us. I came to lean beside her, realizing she was trying to figure out how to begin, and having trouble getting started. "Are you sure you want to know? That's a pretty messed up story, but I suppose we could count it as a part of your education. Maybe it'll help you avoid something that got me in a lot of hot water and canceled the Flat Stanley project for the whole school." I told her I did, pretty intrigued with what could have happened to make a whole school ban something as benign as a kid's art project. "Well, you remember that we sent the little guy around to the school the next town over? Well, then they sent it to another school, and that school sent it to another school, and so on and so forth. We had about the best results out of any of the classes, getting back about twice as much material as is normal. I started integrating it into the curriculum, as you remember, and it was such a huge part of our class. I appreciated the material. Sometimes it's hard to keep kids' attention when they're that young, but Stanley really helped. Then one day, I arrived to find a new package had come the day before. She stopped, shivering a little as she watched the waves. Someone had sent our flat Stanley back, and I was excited as I opened the envelope. We were starting fractions that day. At least we were supposed to, and I wanted to see if there was some way I could work fractions into the package. I would get my wish, but not in the way I wanted. I had reached into my pocket for a cigarette, and Miss Gazel asked if she could have one. I had never seen her smoke before, but as she inhaled that first mouthful, she closed her eyes and looked euphoric. Flat Stanley was supposed to go to Carter Wild Elementary School in Boise, but it appeared he had gone somewhere else. You're too young to remember it, but there was a pretty terrible person in the Midwest in the late 90s. He was picking up young women who were hitchhiking. The police would find them later after he was done with them. Somehow, he got our flat Stanley and thought it would be funny to use him to taunt the police. He had murdered 5 girls that week. Her voice broke as she said it, the tip of the cigarette jittering as she spoke, and attached pictures of them to the Stanley he sent back. They were horrific, and as I spilled them out of my desk, I recognized what I had at once. She was shaking, and as I put my jacket around her, she smiled ruefully at me. "You're a good kid," despite making me relive this. We knew that the kids in my class had all kinds of weird ideas about what had happened, but we also knew that none of you knew the truth. She took a long pull off the cigarette and let the ash dribble down. The first girl in the pictures was Ashley Manx. He had cut her chest open, the X going right between her breasts, and skinned her open like some kind of flower. Her face was set in the worst possible look you've ever seen, and right there in the middle of her chest was Flat Stanley. Your Flat Stanley. I thought I got it then, but Miss Gazel hadn't even gotten rolling yet. Then there was Frances Carmichael, the girl he took from the fair. She was looking for a ride, and he gave her one. He cut her arms and legs off while she was alive, burning the wounds closed with an iron so she'd bleed out slowly. Finally, he cut her throat, and after that, he put 1 foot from that Flat Stanley in her teeth and took a picture. He was standing upright, her body on display, and her burnt nubs are something I still can't quite get out of my head. I'm sorry, I started, but she cut me off. No, you wanted to know, so let me get it out. It's like the confessional I used to go to when I was little. If I get it all out, maybe it won't haunt me as bad. He got Dawn Cambridge and Betsy Cambridge next, split their backs, and made a pair of blood angels out of them. He set Flat Stanley in the middle of them, the crevice between their sides, and snapped a picture. They were still looking for them when they found Ashley. Finally, he got Melanie Fasterly, and she was probably the worst. He beat her with a sledgehammer until her bones were like glass shards. The picture he sent back was unrecognizable as a human being. If it hadn't been for the hair, I would never have known what it was. He stood the cutout between her lumpy legs as if to save her modesty, and she honestly looked about as flat as he was, if you don't count all the bone spurs sticking out of her. Mrs. Gazel was shaking, the shivering causing her to stutter over the last few words, and when she looked back at me, there was regret on her face. All the alcohol had been burned out of her, the fear having shaken it loose as her mind remembered what was likely the worst day of her life. I called the police, of course I did, but my real concern was for you guys. If this psycho had mailed this back to us, then he had the address of the school. If he knew where you were, then he could pay us a visit and make us his next photo collage, and I couldn't have lived with myself if that had happened. So I gave the police everything, and they agreed to keep an eye on the school for a while. I needn't have bothered. The twisted fuck had a particular hunting ground and a particular prey, neither of which were children in Georgia. He never did pay us a visit, but it took 6 more girls before they caught him. I didn't sleep well until they had him in custody, and I didn't sleep soundly until they slipped the needle into his arm last year. He was a rotten, twisted individual, and he deserved every ounce of what he got. I had to take the rest of the week off to recover from his little present, and there was talk that they might want me to undergo counseling. When I got back, the school had scrapped all that flat Stanley stuff. It was too much of a risk that some student would get a hold of it next. And they couldn't have that. Some of the teachers thought we should tell the students. Some of them thought we should tell the parents, and a few of them thought that I should be fired for some reason. It was decided that we wouldn't tell any of them, and we would never speak of it again. In exchange for not causing an uproar, I got to keep my job. I thought it was a pretty fitting trade back then. So that's the whole sad story. Cure your curiosity? It did. Mrs. Gazel was right, too. They offered me a job at the end of my training, and it turned out it was her job. Mrs. Gazel retired at the end of the year, wanting to spend more time with her grandkids and her daughters. We still get drinks sometimes, and she really is a lovely woman. As for me, I noticed one major part of the contract that I was presented with. They put it in bold so you couldn't possibly miss it, so if you break it, you really only have yourself to blame. Under no circumstances will our students participate in any program that sends documents to other schools or entities without the express permission of administration. This includes pen pal programs, Hands Across the Water, the Flat Stanley Project, and other affiliated projects therewithin. I signed that contract 10 years ago, and now I instruct student teachers myself. In the decade I've been teaching, I've never broken that rule, and I have Mrs. Gazel's story to thank for that. When you send something like that out into the world, you never know who might answer back, and what they might have to say.